We are opening our conversation today with an examination of a truly foundational figure in modern music history. We're looking at Ian Curtis,
The English singer, songwriter, and of course, the lead vocalist of Joy Division.
and the material we have in front of us, articles, biographies, critical analyses, it all outlines a life that spanned a mere 23 years, from 1956 to 1980.
It's incredibly short, but what stands out immediately, and what I think we have to focus on, is the sheer overwhelming tension
Tension between what, exactly?
between his rapid artistic ascent on one side and the profound personal turmoil that was just completely consuming him on the other.
That tension is absolutely the central narrative thread we have to follow.
It is. Curtis was, in essence, the lyrical and emotional architect of Joy Division, a band that released 2 albums in incredibly quick succession, Unknown Pleasures in 1979 and then Closer in 1980.
Both of which are considered just, seminal texts of the entire post-punk movement.
Exactly. And what the sources really emphasize is that his brilliant, highly emotive writing emerged directly from a wellspring of severe internal and external pressures.
Absolutely. When you look at the timeline, it's stark. The band's creative peak coincided precisely with the steepest decline in his health and, of course, the collapse of his marriage.
That's a perfect storm.
So, for you, the listener, what we're setting out to do is straightforward. We're going to extract the crucial knowledge points from these sources. We need to explore his foundations as an artist, really delve into the devastating impact of his severe epilepsy and the medications he was prescribed.
And then analyze his unique and, deeply troubled stage presence, and finally trace the incredibly wide and enduring legacy he left behind.
Right. We need to understand not just what happened, but why the pressures became so overwhelming for him.
And we should jump right into his beginnings, which, maybe surprisingly, are marked by this fascinating duality.
So Ian Kevin Curtis was born on July 15, 1956, in Stretford, before his family moved to Macclesfield, where he was raised in a working-class environment.
And the biographical accounts, they all paint a very specific portrait of his childhood. He's described pretty consistently as bookish, intensely intelligent.
And someone who displayed a natural, almost undeniable flair for poetry from a very early age.
Yeah, the initial phase of his life really suggests a trajectory geared more towards academia. His intelligence wasn't just, anecdotal. He excelled,
Right, he passed the 11+ exam.
which was a huge deal in the British education system at the time. It was the test that determined whether you'd go to a more academic grammar school or a more vocational secondary modern.
And passing it granted him a place at the King's School, Macclesfield, a highly respected grammar school.
Exactly. And while he was there, he didn't focus on typical pursuits. His studies were steeped in philosophy and literature. The sources specifically highlight his early engagement with poets like Tom Gunn, which, you can see that focus informing his later lyrical style.
And he did very well there, earning 9.0 levels. But this high level of academic success, it just stands in the stark, immediate contrast with some of the other behavior that started to emerge.
Deeply rebellious and even destructive behavior.
It's almost as if he was 2 different people living in the same body.
That is the compelling tension, right from the very start. He developed this deep, keen interest in music. He was influenced heavily by dramatic, sort of outsider artists.
People like David Bowie and Jim Morrison.
Exactly. But coming from a working-class background, he just couldn't afford the records he craved. So what did the sources tell us he did?
And he started stealing them.
He developed a habit of frequently stealing albums from local shops, often hiding them beneath a long, distinctive gray coat he favored.
And we're not talking about just stealing sweets here. This was a calculated, repeated act, all to feed this burgeoning artistic appetite he had.
It's such an interesting psychological pattern, isn't it? The highly intelligent individual who chooses to flout societal rules for the sake of obtaining, culture.
But this recklessness, it soon escalated far beyond petty theft. It led to a very disturbing incident when he was just 16, one that provides some chilling context for his later struggles with self-harm and impulsivity.
It really does. While he was performing a required social service for school, visiting the elderly, he and a group of friends stole prescription drugs from their patients.
The sources are very specific here. After consuming a very large dosage of a sedative called Largactil, which is chlorpromazine, a powerful antipsychotic medication, he was found unconscious by his father.
He had to be rushed to the hospital. He had his stomach pumped.
That specific detail, stealing a powerful medication like an antipsychotic from an elderly person and then ingesting it in such a quantity that he needed emergency care, it just suggests a level of self-destructive impulse that was present long before the pressures of fame or illness really set in.
It's a shocking detail, a real foreshadowing of the difficulties he would later have with prescription drugs and, his own life.
It absolutely is. And following that turbulent period, despite his academic success at King's, he abandoned his A-level studies at St. John's College.
He'd become disillusioned with formal academia. But crucially, he didn't abandon the creative pursuit. The sources confirm he just kept immersing himself in art and literature. But his focus darkened.
How so?
He began, as they put it, drawing lyrical inspiration from ever more insidious subjects.
So if academia was out, he still needed a path, a job. He ended up pursuing a career in the civil service, which, again, feels highly conventional compared to this inner life he was building.
Incredibly conventional. He worked initially for the Ministry of Defense, but he requested and eventually secured a transfer to the Macclesfield Employment Exchange.
Where he became an assistant disablement resettlement officer.
And that job is so significant. It put him into direct contact with people dealing with severe physical and mental challenges, a theme that would become horribly resonant in his own life just a few years later.
So professionally, he was a facilitator for people facing obstacles, while his own obstacles were mounting internally.
Precisely. At the same time, his domestic life stabilized, or at least appeared to. In August 1975, he married Deborah Woodruff.
He was just 19, she was 18, a very young commitment.
Extremely young. And by 1977, after living initially with family, they managed to purchase their own place at 77 Barton Street in Macclesfield.
That seemingly ordinary terrace house is, of course, now immortalized in his history.
And that house became the setting for both the immense creative work and the deep personal tragedy. The sources recall that one specific room there was designated as Curtis's songwriting room.
It's just fascinating to picture, isn't it? The civil servant by day retreating to the small, specific space to conjure the profoundly dark, evocative lyrics that would come to define a generation.
And the family grew. In April 1979, their only child, a daughter named Natalie, was born.
So by this point, the foundations of his adult life, career, marriage, home, a child, they were all established. But the sources show us that at the same time, the seeds of the band's identity and his own personal decline were already aggressively taking root.
The catalyst that transformed Ian Curtis from a civil servant poet into a performing artist is one of the great anecdotes in Manchester music lore.
It all happened on July 20th, 1976.
That's right. He attended a seminal Sex Pistols gig at the Lesser Free Trade Hall, and he ran into three familiar faces: Bernard Sumner, Peter Hook, and Terry Mason.
And this trio, they were looking to form a band. Curtis, who was clearly already immersing himself in the punk scene, I mean, he was frequently seen wearing a donkey jacket with the word hate scrawled across the back, he just seized the opportunity.
Immediately. He proposed himself as their singer and lyricist, and they started under the name Warsaw.
A direct nod to the David Bowie song Warzawa from his Low album.
That early name is really revealing. Bowie was a huge influence, especially his Berlin period work with its themes of alienation and, post-war Europe.
But they soon realized there was a conflict with a London band called Warsaw Pact, so they had to change it.
And the choice they made, Joy Division, was instantly far more provocative and much, much darker than any of their peers.
And this requires some unpacking because the name itself carries some very heavy historical baggage, which they seem to embrace.
It was derived from the 1953 novella The House of Dolls, a work set in a concentration camp. The Joy Division in the book referred to a specific wing of the camp that was dedicated to the sexual enslavement of female prisoners.
This immediately set a tone. Early on, Joy Division played heavily with controversial and unsettling imagery.
Their first EP cover, for instance, featured a drawing of a Hitler Youth beating a drum. And the song Warsaw was quite explicitly a musical retelling of the life of the senior Nazi Party member, Rudolf Hess.
I think we have to pause here. Given the climate of the late 70s, the punk era, the desire to shock, how did the sources suggest they navigated this controversial aesthetic? Was it purely for shock value?
The sources suggest a complex mix. It was certainly provocative. It was aiming for maximum impact. But it also aligned with Curtis's growing interest in exploring themes of control, despair, and historical horror.
Themes that ran far deeper than the simple nihilism of standard punk.
Exactly. It provided a context for exploring societal decay and the darker side of human nature, which he found endlessly fascinating. This darkness, this embracing of difficult history, it helped define their identity as separate from the rest of the Manchester scene.
And their career solidified pretty quickly after that. The pivotal moment came after an appearance on Granada Television's Vado. So it goes in September 1978.
They caught the eye of the show's presenter, Tony Wilson, who subsequently signed them to his new independent label, Factory Records.
What's amusing and very Curtis is that the sources note this TV appearance was partly prompted by an abusive letter that Curtis had actually sent to Wilson.
He was aggressively demanding attention, even if it was through insult.
And that audacity paid off. Now, while we often think of him purely as a vocalist and lyricist, the sources confirm he did play guitar on stage and in the studio.
Usually when Bernard Sumner transitioned over to the synthesizer.
Right. And he eventually acquired a very specific instrument in September 1979, a Vox Phantom the Sixth Special.
And this detail provides that kind of strange conversational color we look for. The Vox Phantom was a very distinctively shaped instrument. It was known for its built-in effects.
The sources mention one effect was bizarrely misspelled on the control panel as replat.
Which is just a fantastic detail. He used this specific guitar extensively during the early 1980 European tour, and most famously in the video for their most enduring song, Love Will Tear Us Apart.
So despite the band existing for only about 4 years, the sources are completely unanimous. Their influence was disproportionately vast.
Joy Division is consistently credited with essentially inventing, or at least perfecting, the sound of post-punk. They were the first to consciously shift the focus away from the anger and energy that defined early punk rock.
And towards a deep emphasis on mood and expression.
It was atmospheric, it was spacious, and it was intensely melancholic. They redefined what serious alternative music could sound like.
They directly pointed the way toward the defining sounds of the 1980s. When you look at the bands who cite them, it's a veritable who's who of music.
U2, The Cure, Radiohead, Interpol, Block Party.
And even contemporary bands like Fontaines DC and Editors.
And that influence wasn't just confined to rock music. The sources highlight that their sound structure, Peter Hook's signature style of using bass as melody, Stephen Morris's rhythmic non-rock drumming, has been cited by modern rappers.
People like Danny Brown and Vince Staples.
Right. Their aesthetic defined an emotional palette that transcended genre boundaries, really solidifying their status as these accidental pioneers.
They created a sound that was far more durable and emotionally resonant than the members could have ever anticipated.
Especially given that this sound was becoming fully realized, just as Curtis's personal life was spiraling completely out of control.
In this next section, it really represents the heartbreaking core of the narrative. This is where the physical demands of a collapsing body met the psychological demands of sudden fame and personal conflict.
The crisis began with his health. Curtis started experiencing epileptic seizures in late 1978, and the official diagnosis arrived on January 23, 1979.
And the doctors did not mince words. His case was immediately characterized as severe.
The prognosis was dire. Without strict adherence to strong medication, his life would be, and this is a quote, ruled to obsolescence by his severe epilepsy.
Initially, he tried to cope publicly. He even joined the British Epilepsy Association, trying to understand his condition. But soon, the secrecy and the withdrawal began.
And this is a crucial point for you to understand his decline. The condition itself was brutal, but the treatment compounded the psychological toll.
Epilepsy is a chronic neurological disorder characterized by recurrent, unprovoked seizures.
And the sources specifically mention he was enduring tonic-clonic seizures. These are the most severe type, involving loss of consciousness, violent muscle contractions, generalized rigidity. They're physically exhausting and deeply frightening to witness.
And the pressure of continuous touring, the late nights, the stress, the constant travel, it was the exact opposite of what a severe epileptic needed.
The sources confirmed that the condition worsened significantly amid the band's ascent in 79 and 80, making the seizures more frequent and intensely violent.
And the prescribed anticonvulsants, they were themselves a major source of distress.
In the late 70s, these medications were much less refined than modern treatments. They came with a host of severe side effects.
The sources specifically mention he suffered from extreme mood swings, depression, and a significant, palpable change in his personality.
His wife, Deborah, noted that he became notably taciturn and distant in her presence. It made communication almost impossible.
So this combination of severe illness and medication side effects created this profound emotional rift within his family life, which was particularly devastating following the birth of his daughter, Natalie, in April 1979.
And this detail is truly heartbreaking. Due to the unpredictable and violent nature of his seizures, he could seldom hold his own baby daughter safely.
Just imagine the guilt, the fear, the intense emotional isolation. This man, already struggling with internal demons, was now physically barred from bonding with his child because of a disease that was actively attacking his nervous system.
And complicating everything, the sources reveal he stubbornly maintained behaviors that were guaranteed to trigger seizures.
He continued to drink, he continued to smoke, and the touring schedule meant he had wildly irregular sleeping patterns.
It's easy to judge those choices now, but we have to remember the context of the time and, the age of the bandmates. Peter Hook admitted that largely through ignorance, he, Sumner, and Morris didn't truly grasp the severity of what Curtis was facing.
And that ignorance meant they didn't know how to intervene effectively.
Hook explained that when they expressed concern, Curtis would often just tell them what they wanted to hear. He would minimize the suffering.
Maybe to keep the show on the road, or perhaps just to maintain some semblance of dignity or control over his own image.
But the reality was undeniable, especially during the sessions for the album Closer. The sources recount that while recording, he was enduring an average of 2 tonic-clonic seizures every single week.
This wasn't a manageable condition. It was a full-blown crisis.
The incident Hook recounts is just harrowing. He found Curtis unconscious in the studio's toilet, having hit his head on the sink during a collapse. That studio environment, the very place of their greatest artistic achievement, was also a site of severe, repeated physical trauma for him.
And as his physical health disintegrated, his marriage collapsed. In October 1979, the relationship with Annick Honoré, a Belgian journalist and promoter he met at a gig in Brussels, became an affair.
And the sources really convey the intense psychological burden this placed on him. He was racked by guilt. A new father, married young, yet he simultaneously yearned for Honoré, who represented something outside the confines of his deteriorating domestic life.
The internal conflict became so extreme that he sought external help for a decision that was really his alone to make.
Yeah, the sources reveal that on one occasion in early 1980, he actually asked Bernard Sumner to decide his future for him.
He asked him, should I stay with Deborah or commit to a deeper relationship with Annick?
And Sumner, very wisely, refused to take on that responsibility.
The biographical accounts are complicated here by conflicting testimony. Deborah Curtis maintained that the relationship with Honoré was fully romantic and sexual.
Honoré, however, claimed in a later interview that while they were deeply committed emotionally and spent extensive time together, the relationship was platonic.
Regardless of the physical reality, the emotional conflict was undeniable and destructive.
The affair caused a palpable distance from his bandmates. They noted he became increasingly lofty and isolated. For Deborah, it was the final straw. She commenced divorce proceedings in early 1980.
And the sources are definitive about his resulting mental state. They say he found it intensely difficult to balance family obligations, his massive musical ambition, and his worsening health, concluding that he was, quote, never mentally equipped for living alone.
And this internal and external chaos manifested most visibly in his iconic stage presence.
His unique on-stage dancing style became famously reminiscent of his seizures. It was immediately recognizable and frequently termed his epilepsy dance.
Let's truly explore that. This wasn't just a quirky dance. It was a physical transformation. Was it a conscious artistic choice? Or was it just the inevitable physical manifestation of his disease?
It was likely both, which is what makes it so compelling and so disturbing.
The sources suggest he realized early on that his movements, which were increasingly spastic and unconventional, created an electric hypnotic effect on the audience. He channeled the physical distress into performance energy.
But as the illness progressed, the line between performance and pathology just dissolved. The movements became less about expression and more about physical inevitability.
And the performances frequently culminated in a full, terrifying collapse. The band took precautions. Flashing lights, a common rock staple, were prohibited at Joy Division gigs because they were a known seizure trigger.
But even with precautions, the danger remained. Bernard Sumner noted that certain intense, percussive sounds could still sometimes trigger a seizure.
The most frightening instance occurred at the Rainbow in Finsbury Park in April 1980. Despite explicit instructions, technicians switched on strobe lights mid-set.
Curtis staggered backward, immediately collapsing into Stephen Morris's drum kit, experiencing a photosensitive seizure. He had to be physically carried off stage.
And beyond the seizures triggered by external stimuli, The sources describe a deeply reckless, almost self-destructive element to his performance choices.
Peter Hook recounted one anecdote where Curtis dropped a pint pot on stage, smashing it, and then deliberately rolled around in the broken glass.
He ended up cutting a 10-inch gash in his thigh. It's hard to view this as anything other than an act of deep frustration or self-harm played out in public.
This constant visible battle, the seizure dance, the collapsing, the cuts, it made his art authentic, but it made his life unsustainable.
By early 1980, he was a man simultaneously peaking creatively while grappling with a severe, poorly managed chronic illness, immense guilt, and the dismantling of his domestic life. The stage was set for the tragic final weeks.
The final chapter begins with a clear sign of his psychological distress becoming lethal. We know that the pressure culminated in his first definite suicide attempt on April 6, 1980.
It involved an overdose of barbiturates, and the sources give us specific, disturbing details about this.
After writing an initial note, he experienced panic.
And he called Deborah, but not out of fear of dying. He was afraid he hadn't taken enough medication and would be left with irreversible brain damage.
Deborah subsequently called the ambulance. This fear of being rendered obsolete or damaged by his condition seems to have just fueled his desperation.
Following this attempt, there was an intervention. Tony Wilson and his partner, Lindsay Reed, took him to recuperate at their cottage in Charlesworth, Derbyshire.
They were profoundly concerned that the relentless touring schedule was actively undermining his mental and physical health.
And while recuperating at the cottage, he poured his conflicted feelings into letters. The sources reveal he wrote several letters to Annick Honoré, proclaiming his intense, consuming love for her.
So even in the midst of recovery from a near-fatal act, the emotional tension of that relationship triangle was still defining his reality.
But the immediate professional pressure, it refused to relent. Looming over everything was the band's debut North American tour, scheduled to begin later that month.
And the sources indicate that Curtis viewed this prospect with, quote, extreme trepidation.
His fears were twofold. First, he had a profound phobia of flying and desperately wanted to travel by ship.
But second, and perhaps more psychologically damaging, he expressed deep concern that American audiences who might be less familiar with the band and less empathetic would mock his epilepsy.
He feared humiliation on a global scale.
This anxiety connected back to a morbid premonition he had apparently shared with both Deborah and Honoré over the years.
That he never expected to live past his early 20s. He felt his medical condition was either likely to kill him outright or lead to such intense suffering and mockery that life would become unbearable.
Which brings us to the final night, Saturday, May 17th, 1980. Curtis asked Deborah to stop the divorce proceedings.
She offered to stay, knowing how fragile he was. However, after returning from speaking to her parents, his demeanor had shifted again. He insisted on spending the night alone at 77 Barton Street.
And he made her promise not to return before his scheduled 10 a.m. train to Manchester to meet the bandmates for the journey to the U.S.
The details of his final hours are grimly specific. They provide a kind of cultural window into his mental state. The sources confirm he spent his final hours watching Werner Herzog's 1977 film, Strassek.
The choice of film is incredibly resonant. Strassek is a deeply nihilistic film about an alienated street musician who attempts to build a new life in rural America, but finds only failure and humiliation.
And it leads to a desperate, self-destructive end. It's a cinematic portrayal of inevitable failure and societal alienation.
And what he chose to listen to provides even more psychological context. After the film, he put on Iggy Pop's 1977 album, The Idiot.
The significance here is profound, as cultural analyst Konja Stark highlights. Iggy Pop's album title was directly inspired by Fyodor Dostoevsky's novel, The Idiot,
which centers on Prince Mishkin, a spiritually sensitive epileptic prince who is slowly driven mad by society's cruelty and misunderstanding.
The resonance between that fictional character, Dostoevsky's own epilepsy, and Curtis's own condition is just staggering. He was consuming culture that mirrored and amplified his deepest fears of alienation and madness.
Deborah returned to 77 Barton Street the following morning, Sunday, May 18, 1980, soon after he would have met his bandmates. She found his body.
Ian Curtis died by suicide at the age of 23, having used the kitchen's washing line.
He had left a note for Deborah. The sources reveal a heartbreaking complexity in it. He affirmed his love for her despite the affair, but also claimed he simply could not be cruel enough to Annick Honoré to tell her he wished to end contact, even if it meant saving his marriage.
The final lines describe him hearing the birds singing at dawn, but the sources confirmed the note did not explicitly state his intent to kill himself, only requested that Deborah not contact him for a while.
Looking back, the tragedy of the timing is just amplified by the band's creative position. Lindsay Reed reported that Curtis had confided in her shortly before his death that he felt he simply couldn't continue with performances because of his epilepsy.
And that he believed the band had reached an artistic pinnacle with the impending release of Closer.
This sense of hitting a wall, both physically and creatively, it suggests he felt there was nowhere else to go but down.
The profound regret from his bandmates echoes this. Bernard Sumner reflected that it wasn't until they truly immersed themselves in the released lyrics after his death that they fully comprehended the inner turmoil he was writing about.
And there's a vital medical detail that comes to light later, emphasizing the external forces at play in his death.
Peter Hook revealed that an epilepsy specialist later examined Curtis's prescription regimen and expressed significant concerns about the safety and efficacy of the specific combination of anticonvulsant drugs he had been taking.
This is a critical insight. It suggests that while his underlying condition and his personal life were sources of immense distress, the poorly managed and potentially dangerous medical cocktail he was on likely exacerbated his mental health crisis.
Including depression and suicidal ideation. It really emphasizes the need for holistic care, something largely unavailable in 1980.
Following his death, his body was cremated 5 days later, on May 23, 1980, in Macclesfield. His ashes were buried at Macclesfield Cemetery, and his memorial stone, of course, is famously inscribed with his dates and the simple, heartbreaking dedication, "Love will tear us apart."
The shock was immense, but the sources are quick to point out that the music did not stop. Shortly after Curtis's cremation, the surviving members Bernard Sumner, Peter Hook, and Stephen Morris, along with manager Rob Gretton, made a conscious decision to continue.
They formed a new group. Initially, they called themselves the No Names, fulfilling a pre-death agreement that if any one member left, the band would change its name.
They swiftly renamed themselves New Order.
New Order was immediately born from the ashes of Joy Division, maintaining the continuity of the artistic endeavor, even while shedding the dark, overwhelming emotional baggage associated with their previous identity.
And New Order immediately began incorporating elements that directly referenced their departed singer.
A physical piece of Ian Curtis's legacy literally carried over into the new band. Bernard Sumner inherited and began using that distinct Vox Phantom VI special guitar that Curtis had acquired.
And the sources confirmed this instrument was used in early New Order recordings, including the track Everything's Gone Green. It's a symbol of a musical and material transition.
And New Order honored him explicitly through their songs. On their debut album, Movement, there were 2 clear tracks.
ICB, which stood for Ian Curtis Buried, and the track, The Hymn.
Later, in 1985, they released the sweeping instrumental piece, Elegia, written directly in his memory. They continued this dedication much later, including their 2002 song, Here to Say, which was dedicated to Curtis, Rob Gretton, and Martin Hannett.
And the wave of tributes wasn't limited to his former bandmates. Joy Division's label mates, the Durutti Column, paid tribute with The Missing Boy.
Other artists across different eras have continually expressed their debt to him, including Psychic TV, the post-hardcore band Thursday, and Juju, who released the track Ian Curtis Wishlist.
It just confirms the profound reach of his creative influence.
In terms of documenting his complex life, the sources highlight 2 major publications. The first, and arguably most crucial for our understanding, is Deborah Curtis's 1995 biography, Touching from a Distance.
This book provided the first intimate, detailed account of their marriage,
Wow.
his struggles with epilepsy, and that highly conflicted relationship with Anna Conneray.
Later, in 2006, Mick Middles and Lindsay Reed released Torn Apart. The Life of Ian Curtis, which offered a more documentary-style perspective, incorporating private photographs and excerpts from the letters Curtis wrote to Honoré,
which provided a more detailed look into his conflicted final months.
His story also translated successfully onto the screen. He was first portrayed by Sean Harris in the 2002 film 24-Hour Party People,
which was a dramatic comedy focusing on the history of factory records and the Manchester scene. But the truly definitive cinematic portrayal came with the 2007 biographical film Control.
Control, directed by the Dutch photographer Anton Corbijn and starring Sam Riley, was heavily based on Deborah Curtis's book. It meticulously detailed his troubled marriage, the agonizing reality of his poorly medicated epilepsy, his depression, and the dizzying speed of his rise to fame.
It brought the tragedy of his final years to a much wider mainstream audience.
And the enduring significance of his life is perhaps best illustrated by the ongoing drama surrounding 77 Barton Street, the house where he died in Macclesfield.
When the property went on sale in 2014, it became a lightning rod for fan sentiment.
The sources recount that a dedicated fan campaign was launched via the platform Indiegogo with the explicit goal of raising £150,000 to purchase the house.
And the goal was to convert it into a museum or a dedicated memorial space. This campaign highlighted the desire of the community to preserve the physical space of his creation and tragedy.
However, the campaign ultimately failed. It raised only about £2,000, which was later donated to the Epilepsy Society and Mind charities, recognizing the causes that contributed to his demise. The house was sold privately.
But the saga wasn't over. In 2015, an entrepreneur and musician named Hadar Goldman stepped in. He purchased the property not just by matching the price, but by paying a substantial premium.
The sources detail he paid a £75,000 compensation fee on top of the £125,000 house price just to reverse the prior private sale.
Goldman stated his intentions were ambitious, to create a Joy Division museum and a digital hub to support struggling musicians globally. This move generated renewed enthusiasm among fans.
But the sources, as of 2025, confirm that despite his purchase and stated goals, that public museum has not yet materialized at 77 Barton Street.
The house remains a private residence, highlighting the difficulty in translating passion into permanent public remembrance.
Yet his memory continues through decentralized, fan-created memorials globally. One striking example is in Wellington, New Zealand.
The Ian Curtis Wall on Wallace Street has existed there since 1980. The simple recurring message, "Ian Curtis lives," is painted and repainted there continuously. Even when local city council teams paint over it, the message invariably returns.
It illustrates the power of cultural memory. And closer to home, his image was utilized for a powerful mental health awareness initiative.
In October 2020, aligned with the Headstock Mental Well-Being Festival, a large black and white portrait mural of Ian Curtis was painted by street artist Axby P19 on the side of a building in Manchester's northern quarter.
These memorials just confirm that his image and story remain deeply embedded in the cultural landscape, forever linked to themes of artistic brilliance and the vital importance of mental and physical welfare.
So if we synthesize all this material, we return to that core tension we started with.
Right.
What the sources reveal is the profound vulnerability of an exceptionally gifted artist whose body and mind were increasingly failing him due to a severe and, frankly, poorly managed chronic illness.
His epilepsy, the difficult medication cocktail, and the immense isolating pressure of fame and relationship conflict, it all just culminated in tragedy.
Understanding this context is absolutely critical to appreciating the raw, authentic, and emotionally devastating intensity that defines Joy Division's work.
We've seen in granular detail how his intensely personal struggle with the medication side effects, the marital conflict, the seizure disorder, it wasn't just reflected in, but was inextricably woven into the band's entire aesthetic.
Culminating in an undeniable artistic peak, just as his life reached its breaking point.
And we covered his intense fear of that upcoming North American tour. He was worried about how audiences would react to his seizures and how his physical limitations would compromise the band's career.
So think about this. Consider the implications of modern society's vastly improved understanding, awareness, and accommodations for chronic neurological conditions like epilepsy. Compare that to the largely uninformed, unsympathetic, and demanding environment he faced in 1980. What responsibility does the machine of fame place on managing and prioritizing an artist's welfare above the relentless demands of a touring schedule? That quotient still resonates today.
Thanks for listening.
We hope this analysis of the sources proved valuable to you.